Okay, so this week we are try it again. We're going to start with vaYiqra, chapter 25, verse 7. I know we did that last week, but just 10, 15 minutes into it, the whole system froze up and not a lot got accomplished there. What? No, I meant 7. So anyway, that's where we're going to start. And as is my custom, we're going to back up to verse 6, which is what I was trying to tell my wife a while ago. But anyway, so let me give you my translation of verse 6. It says, and the Shabat of the land. So the rest of the land. In other words, not the rest of the land that's left over, but the not plowing the land and planting the land, vegetables or corn or grain or hay or whatever. Not doing that. We're going to rest the land. That's another word I could use that just seems confusing to me, because rest can be leftover, the rest of it. But no, I mean rest as in taking a nap, right? Stop working. So it says, and the Shabat of the land will be for your food. It will be for your, you're not going to plant anything. You're not going to harvest anything. You're not going to get any of that food or any of that, but it's for your food, it says. For you, for your male servants, for your maid servants, your sahir, which are your indentured servants, and for the toshav, which are foreigners, that garim, that are dwelling among you. So, in the not last week, week before, whenever it was, before we started having the trouble, I didn't really get to talk about what some of these words meant, at least not to the degree I really did. So I'm going to do that again today. Given that I did it last week, but the video didn't work. The first thing that stands out is that if you remember the previous verses, they've already told us that we are not to plant anything, we're not to harvest anything, we're not to gather anything. So why would God say this is for your food? And then it says it's for you. Okay, if I'm listening to what Robert just said, then you must be me. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, then it says your male servants. It doesn't really generally say that. It just gives the word for servant, but the word for servant is in the past tense masculine. So if you know that reading Hebrew, you would know it's your male servant. And then they give a slightly different word that means female servant. Now, these servants, these Eved, are not slaves. They are not a people that you went into Africa and stole them or bought them from other Africans and put them on a boat and tied them to chains on that boat and then shipped them over to America. And, they were sold to other human beings and were the property of those other human beings, et cetera, et cetera. It's nothing like that. Did earlier Christians believe it was? Of course they did, because it was translated to say slave. Okay, that's not the right word. Probably was the right word back in, say, the 1300s, maybe even the 1500s, but was not the right word in the 1800s, and certainly isn't the right word today. So what we have to understand about these servants is these servants are people who they get a salary for their work. They're paid for their work, just like you are. If you go to work every, 5 or 6 days a week, and at the end of all that, at the end of the week or every 2 weeks or every month or whatever it is, you get a paycheck. So did they. The difference is they lived with the person they worked for. That person provided a place for them to live, sleeping quarters, maybe even a house, just depending on who you were and what you did. You may live in bunk beds out in a kind of a log cabiny type thing, where several other hired hands who, maybe plowed the fields and harvested and stuff like that. Maybe they lived out there, where if you're there to do their accounting and run their whole organization, you might be living in a house of your own. I mean, that was all totally negotiable, and there were no right or wrong ways to do that. It's just whatever you decided, as a person who's hiring this individual and a person who's being this individual, that was just worked out between you, right? And so you had the male servants who did that, and you had the female servants. And the Bible does talk about the parents selling their children into this type of servitude. And of course, see there, that person owned them. No, that person didn't. They just lived with them. And they would make this deal for a certain number of years generally, because what they're trying to do, the men, for instance, are trying to save up enough money. The whole reason why you do it is, one, you don't have to spend any of your money. You've got a place to live. You got clothing to wear, food to eat. All that's provided by your employer. Plus, you get to save all your money. And on top of that, you'll probably get to leave with, some sheep and some goats and maybe some cows. And who knows, you might even get some land. Again, it's all negotiable. So the more you get, the longer you're going to stay. And these families would, they use the word sell, and that's what throws everybody. They're not for sale. They are not owned by the person whom they work for. The whole point was that they live with them so that they can have a future. And so it's servitude, but it's not slavery. Okay, that's your male and your female servants. Then it says the sahir, which that's forced servitude. See, there you go. No, probably not what you think. If you get yourself in debt, if you're terrible with money, and some people are, if you're terrible with money and you get yourself in a whole lot of debt and you can't pay that debt back, the person you owe that money to used to be able to go to the court and say, hey, this guy owes me umpteen, millions of dollars, and I'd like to get it back, and he's not paying me. Then the court would say, okay, well, he now has to work for you for, however many years it takes for him to pay it off. Well, you don't go in and take that man's house. You don't take his land. You don't take his wife and his kids. That guy is now going to go to your house. He's going to earn a salary. He's going to be given a place to live, food to eat. He's going to get all the same things, but no doubt he's going to get a lot less of it, because most of that's got to go back to paying off his debt. Now, if you got into so much debt that you couldn't possibly pay it off in your lifetime, the courts may actually at that point force your wife and some of your kids, if not all of them, and we're talking grown adults, not little bitty children, into working off that debt as well. And yes, God set it up that way. He's very serious about, if you get yourself in debt, you need to pay your debt, right? So then you have the indentured servant. That's what we're talking about. He's been forced to go pay off his debt, and until that debt is paid, he will not leave. Something like a really good rabbi once said. Anyway, then it says, and for the toshav, which that's a foreigner. That's somebody that is. If you live in Israel, and somebody from Italy comes and lives in Israel, well, he's a foreigner. He's from another land. And by that, if you're calling him Toshav, that means he is not a citizen. Now, once that person converted to Judaism back in those days, he then became a citizen and he was no longer a foreigner. But while you were in that state of, I'm just passing through, I'm going to be here for a couple of years. Maybe I found a person who will let me work for him and I can leave with some goats, and that was perfectly fine. But they would be called a foreigner. So surely, you can understand the idea of somebody from Italy being called a foreigner. But if you live in Israel and you live right on the border of Egypt, and the guy next to you, 40 feet from your house on his side of the property, and he's not Jewish, he's going to be called a foreigner. So you have to understand what they're talking about. Anyone who was not Jewish, and in this case, Torah observant. You had to be Torah observant because it was the law of the Jewish land. That's what we're going through, is the constitution of Yisrael as put together by God Almighty. Written out by Moshe, but dictated by God, right? This is their constitution. So it is the law of the land. In other words, if you lived in Israel, you had to be Torah observant. That's God's law. Anyone who does not fit that category is, in fact, koshav, a foreigner. That's the main thing you have to understand, because the Torah, the word of God, was not written for the whole world. It was written by Jews to Jews concerning matters of the Jewish religion, the Jewish law, the Jewish God, all things Jewish, and nothing beyond Judaism. You really need to understand that when you're learning the law of God. If you're a Christian living in America, this book was not written for you. All right? Even the guy Christians called Jesus, his name was actually Yeshua, got transliterated and over time became Jesus. When he was walking around, had his disciples and all that, he himself said, I am not come, or the way we would say it now, I did not come, but for the lost sheep of the house of Yisrael, the house of Israel. He did not come for you Christians, period, end of story, or Jesus is a bald-faced liar. All right, let me move on. So the overall idea here in verse 6 is that the not planting food, the not harvesting food, the not gathering food, the not eating food, how is that for your food? How are you supposed to not do any of those things, and this is somehow for your food? Well, verse 20, I'm going to jump quite a ways ahead here. In verse 20, God says that the people are going to say, he's telling you what they're thinking. He's putting it out there. What will we eat in the 7th year? Now, wait a minute. It just said this was for your food. But God knows what they're going to ask, what they're thinking. What will we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we will not sow, nor will we gather our crops. Why would this question be asked by the Hebrew-speaking Yehudim, Jews of that time? Didn't they understand Hebrew? I don't know. They just came out of Egypt. How would they know? Okay, whatever. They obviously understood verses 5, 6, and 12 to mean you don't eat this food. They obviously took it some other way than it when it says it's for your food. They obviously did not take it as, okay, that means we eat it. God knew that, so he brings it up. Well, you know, it would help if you would ask this question. Is this Shabat, this rest of the land, this not planting, not not cultivating the fields, not sowing, not reaping, not eating. Is this for the benefit of giving us something to eat that year? Or is it for the benefit of that dirt? No one's supposed to eat the food. The wild food is supposed to fall to the ground to replenish the soil. So that, as it said, you, your male servants, your maid servants, your servants, indentured servants, and for the Toshav, the foreigner, so that those people who dwell among you will continue to harvest good food and bountiful crops forever. If farmers refuse to rest their land, they will have to turn to chemicals and or big giant dump trucks to bring fresh soil in. Because if you don't rest that land, all of the nutrients in that land will be gone after 6 years. All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump into verse 7. Very literal English. It says, and to cattle you and to living that in land you shall be all crop to eat. So we have veli vehem techa, which is and to cattle you, very literally. So it's and for your cattle. And yeah, it's those things that say moo, right? But it is followed with velachaya, which sounds an awful lot like will be, but it's from the word lachaim, or lachaim, to life, the thing that so many Jews like to say when they hold up their glass of wine, because it's a toast, if you will. But it's that word living. And the word living in this context is just talking about animals in general. So we could say livestock, that would be okay, but it's that livestock would indicate domesticated animals. And by using this word, it's all animals. You realize if you have a farm, there's a lot more animals on your farm than just the ones you feed and tend to and slaughter for food and sell for profit and all the things that farmers do, or ranchers, if you want to call them that. Because back in these days, there's really no separation. I mean, there are some that would have just farmed the land and wouldn't have had animals, but most people would have had farmed the land and would have had animals both, just like we did when I was growing up. But anyway, it's you have rabbits that are in your field that you're trying to keep away from your vegetables. You had your neighbor's horses that if they got too close to the fence could just reach over and eat your corn. I learned real early on that you don't plant the corn by the fence. You live and you learn. But I would say my parents knew that I shouldn't do that, but decided to let me learn the hard way. But I don't think my parents actually knew. They were terrible farmers. We almost starved to death. But anyway, of course, I hear that most farmers have that happen from time to time. We had it our whole lives growing up. But anyway, so we're talking about just animals in general, not necessarily the domesticated animals, although that would certainly be included. Then it says, Asher be'al zecha, in land you, or in your land. So not the whole earth, it's the land of Israel. Remember, this is all about the Jews, to the Jews, for the Jews, of the Jews. Go on and on. It had nothing to do with anyone else. So instead of saying earth, like so many passages do, it just should say land. Anyway, this is TS, so it will be Kol Tevuata. It will be for all of your crops. Why is it important that we say that? Well, because you may plant some tomatoes and some green beans and some potatoes and what else? some corn and, just whatever vegetables that you have the seeds for that, that you really want to eat when that stuff comes about. You may plant all of that stuff in your fields, but if you have cattle and sheep and goats and whatever else, maybe you have some camels and some donkeys and stuff like that. Yeah, Jews had those. We didn't eat them, but we did have them for the purpose of work or whatever. You had to feed them, right? I mean, unless you owned thousands of acres of land and only had 20 or 30 heads or whatever, you couldn't just let them live off the land. And in some places, even if you had enough land that would grow enough stuff to keep those animals fed, in other words, you're not feeding them hay or grain or whatever to supplement their diet. Even if you had enough, what do you do in years of drought? What are your animals going to eat those years? Right? There's all kinds of reasons why you better store some stuff up. You better plant some hay. You better plant some alfalfa. You better plant some grain and stuff like that. Because otherwise, how are you going to feed an animal that you don't have because it's starved to death? When it comes time to plow your fields, you're going to do that by hand. Well, you're not going to get a lot of food that way. Even if you have 8 kids, there's only so much land that you can prep, plant, and grow food on with a limited number of people, right? You needed those donkeys and those cows and those oxen and stuff like that to pull those plows. Yes, they had them all the way back then. But anyway, so your crop is not necessarily not likely to be just what you eat. You also have to have crops to feed your animals, supplement their food, especially in bad times like drought. This is le'echol, which is to eat. And so we still may have this, oh my gosh, what? All right, so my translation. And I'm going to add a couple of words here that are not there in Hebrew, but is meant by the Hebrew. In other words, if I'm going to translate this into English so that you understand what the Hebrew meant, I may sometimes have to add some words, and it's going to happen quite often. As long as my words don't change the meaning of the Hebrew, then it's perfectly okay for me to add some words here. Now, what I do is I put them in square brackets, and I make them italicized, and I even change the color so that you'll know I've added this for clarity. So if you ever actually get to read any of my books, you'll see that I've done that. But if on the other hand, I add words that change the meaning, now I'm breaking God's law, because he said you don't add to or take away from the word of God, right? It doesn't mean you don't use extra words. It means that you don't change the meaning by adding some things or maybe taking some things away. That's what God's talking about. So anyway, it says, and for, and I put in those square brackets, the benefit of your cattle and the livestock that is in your land, all the produce shall be for consumption. So you understand that you have to pick up on what we've already said. These people have heard these rules already. They've already been told they can't plant, they can't reap, they can't even gather, because there's 2 different things. To reap is to cut down the field for the purpose of gathering it up, right? You can't do any of that. You can't cut it down. You can't gather it. You can't have it. That's the point. And the people are going to ask in verse 20, oh, what are we supposed to eat? So we know good and well that verse 7 is not telling us, when it says for consumption, that this is for the animals to eat. No, it's not. The same thing applies here. If you're growing hay and alfalfa and grain for your animals and you don't rest that land, a few years down the road, you're not going to have any hay, alfalfa, and grain to feed your animals. You have to replenish the nutrients in that ground in order for your plants to keep growing up. It's And by doing so, it's for your food. It's for you to be able to consume. But you have to not do it this year, this seventh year, so that you will have that food. All right, so let's move on to verse 8, which is quite a bit longer. Very literally, and count you to you 7 Sabbaths, in plural, 7 Sabbaths years, 7 times, and be they to you days 7 Sabbaths, the years 9 and 40 years. So you're going to kind of get a crash course in this verse in the way Hebrew idioms work. Now, this is not exactly an idiom. It's a numbering system, a counting system. It's the way they did math back then, right? Or at least to do math verbally. You know, they probably did something closer to what we think of, put down numbers and all that kind of stuff, right? Although their numbers were also their letters. They would have done that if they're writing it out. But when you're talking, they had a different way of doing it that actually works exactly the same way the idioms work. So I think this is a good time to kind of try to teach you how to recognize an idiom, because the Bible is utterly jam-packed with them. All right, so we have vaYiqra, and count you. So we would say, and you count, or and you will count, right? But the funny thing is, this is from the word of scratching and scraping. It's of the idea of taking a chisel and a hammer and pounding out something into stone. It's from that. Remember, it's a primitive language, so they have a lot fewer words that have to cover a lot, a whole lot of subjects, where in our language, in English, we have a whole lot of words to cover very few subjects. That's very much the opposite of the way we think. Okay, so they're saying you're going to count for yourselves. It says lacha, to you, to yourself. Sheva, which is the word for 7. Shabbatot, so 7 Sabbaths. I don't know if that comes out clear enough or not, but it's Sabbath in plural. So you've got 7 of them. That's plural. Then it says shanim. You got 7 Sabbaths years. Then it says Sheva, Shanim, Sheva, Pa'amim. 7 Sabbath years, 7 years, 7 times. We would say 7 times 7. Then it says the hayu, so and it will be to you or to them, lecha, to you. Understand, in Hebrew, each individual word they're going to repeat the to you part, or the to him, or to them, or to her. That's going to wind up in most of the words. That doesn't mean that we need to translate that word over and over again. We don't need to do that in English. We don't speak or think that way in English, but that is how it's written out in Hebrew and spoken, by the way. So let's see, what word do we have? So yemei, that's days. That's not years. It just said something about 7 years, 7, blah, blah, blah. And now it's saying days. Then it says Sheva Shabbatot. Now we're back to 7 years. There are 7 Sabbaths anyway. So it got days, 7 Sabbaths. Then it says Hashanim, the years. Tesha, which means 9. Ve'arba'im, and 40 Shana, 40 years. What? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. And you will count for yourselves 7 times 7 years. So 7 Sabbaths of years means 7 times 7. And the days, or the period of time, is what they mean by this, of the 7 Sabbaths, the 7 times 7 Sabbaths, the length of time, that time period, will be 49 years. So this verse contains 4 idioms. 2 of the idioms are written with the explanation of the idiom first, followed by the idiom. And 2 of the idioms, the other 2, are written with the idiom first and then followed by the meaning of the idiom. These are the 2 things that we have to look for when we're looking at Hebrew to understand if we're looking at an idiom. It's 99.9% of the time you'll get this in your Hebrew idiom. All right, so our first one, the idiom itself, it says count to you, right? That's what the text says. Well, that's the idiom. Well, what does it mean? Here's how you set the date on your calendar. It doesn't mean you're supposed to sit there and take a hammer and a chisel and chisel little marks into this stone until you get to the number 49. No, all you got to do is, okay, 7 times 7, that's 49. So it's idiomatic. Count to you does not mean you literally have to sit there and count. It's just telling you, here's how you set the date on your calendar. The next one is 7 Shabbatot years. So 7 Sabbath in plural years. 7 Sabbath years. So that means 7 times 7 years, i.e., 49 years. Then the next one, 7 Sabbaths, the years. But the meaning is 9, or what they wrote was 9 and 40 years. Well, what's 9 and 40 years? 7 Sabbaths years, i.e., 49 years. So you have 2 of these idioms are telling you that the time period is 49 years. The first one tells you this is how you're going to, where or how you're going to mark your calendar. The 2 after that tell you in 2 different ways, this is 49 years. And then the last one, the period of time will be, because it just says days. Days is a period of time. So those people who run around saying that God created the earth in literally 6 24-hour periods of time are utterly and completely wrong. What do you do with God saying, in the day you were in Egypt? That day was 430 years. What about when God said, in the day you were in the wilderness? Well, that day was 40 years. Are you starting to get the idea here that days represents a period of time? And the day of the 7 times 7 years is 49 years. Starting to catch on? So when God creates the heavens and the earth, the first day could be infinity times infinity to the infinite power. It makes no difference. First off, time doesn't exist when God starts this whole thing. If it exists even at all today, physicists are arguing that it doesn't even exist. It's a total illusion, which their arguments are very convincing. You ought to listen to someone talk about it, a physicist talk about that. It's very interesting. Time doesn't exist for sure on day one. So how long it took for him to do what he did on day one, we don't actually know. It's eternal. Eternal. There's an eternity before the eternity started when he started the work. There's an eternity during the work. There's an eternity after the work. It's infinite. There is no time. So if we apply what we know is time to that, well, then we can say it's 100 bazillion years and we'll be right. To say it's 24 hours, you've got a problem. Because it's not until the day 4 that you get a sun and a moon that the planet can, and the moon, a sun that the planet and the moon can be spinning around, which takes 24 hours. That doesn't happen until day 4. Right? Time doesn't exist until day 4. Just saying, just throwing that out there. But that does not mean that from day 4 on, you get a 24-hour day period where God's talking about things. Has nothing to do with it. That's just the illusion that we came up with much later in time. So there is no limit to how long it took for God to do these things. You can't put a time according to our understanding to it, because God does not exist in time. He lives completely outside of it. Anywho, I think physicists are going to prove beyond a doubt at some point that we do as well, but because the sun comes up and goes down in 24 hours, we think we live in time. But the truth is we probably don't. Anyway, yeah, okay, we're doing good. The next verse, 9, very literal. And pass over you shofar noise in new moon, the 7th, in 10th to new moon, in day the covering shall make Passover they shofar in all land your. Then we have vaYiqra, which is and make Passover you. So now you got to make a Passover. You got to celebrate Passover. Pesach is not part of this word. So this is actually a passing over. It's like crossing from one side of the stream over to the other side. You're passing over the stream, even though you're actually literally going through it, because you passed from one side to the other. There's also of a stream overflowing its banks, because it's passed over its banks. So what do you figure they're saying here when they say pass over shofar? You make the sound of a shofar, which is a horn, a ram's horn. You make that pass over the land of Israel, is what we're going to learn from that. So probably going to need more than one. just saying, Israel is not a great big place, but I don't think one shofar would be heard by everybody, even back then. You'd still have the noise of all the animals and the people bustling and doing their thing. Anyway, so your next word, of course, was shofar. Then this is teruah. So now, you're not celebrating the feast of teruah. That's actually a feast. We call it the Feast of Trumpets these days, but the word means noise. Noise. You're going to pass over the noise of a trumpet. Has got to pass over the land of Israel, to be specific. Then it says Ba Chodesh. So that's in new moon. What's a new moon? Well, we would translate that in English generally as month. It's a new month. This is Ha Shevi'i, so it's the month of the 7th, so the 7th month. Be'asur, in the 10th. La Chodesh, which means to new moon. In the 7th, actually this could go either way. It could be the 7th day of the 10th new moon or the 10th day of the 7th new moon. We'll find out. This is Beyom, in day. Then I went too far. Ha Kippurim. I know that that these days the holiday is called Yom Kippur. No, Yom Kippur by most people these days. Wow, or Yom Kippur. Nobody seems to want to say it right. But the word is in plural. It is never supposed to be said in singular. I hate that people do that. It's we have Be Yom, so in the day Haki Purim, so in the day of covering. In that day, so the day that Yom Kippurim instead of Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippurim, when that day comes around, that is the day that Ta'aviru, the passing over shofar. So that, remember that noise of the shofar. This is the day that noise is going to pass over the land. The whole in all aharetzechem, which is from aretz, all of your land. What are they saying? All of Israel. That's the land that belongs to the Jews. That's the land that God gave to the Jews. And it's all of your land means all of Israel. You don't actually have to say Israel when you say your land, because it's written by the Jews, to the Jews, concerning the Jews. They're not talking about America. They're not talking about Europe. They are talking about Israel, otherwise known these days as Israel. All right, so our translation. And you will make Passover the noise of a shofar, ram's horn, shofar, on the 10th day of the 7th new moon, on the Yom Kippurim, on the day of coverings. You shall make Passover the shofar, the noise of the shofar, in all your land. And all of Israel needs to hear this. Pseudo Jonathan calls the blowing of the horn on the sabbatical year, because that's what we're talking about, is the sabbatical year, in case we've kind of forgotten where we are. He called it the Horn of Freedom. I love that title. That's a great title. It's not biblical, but I do like the title. Let's go with it. All right, so yeah. Our next one's a little bit long-winded as well. And consecrate you years the 50th year, and call out you all flowing inland to all dwell her. Jubilee she shall be to you, and return you man to possession he, to his possession, and man to family he shall return they. If somebody owns this man, why is God making this man be given back to his family? Not very good ownership. Anyway, Ki Dashtem, which is from Kodesh, Kadosh, from purifying and cleansing and all of that kind of stuff. So you're going to make this holy. You're going to make this a purification. You're going to make a ritual out of this, is kind of exactly what's being said here. Et Shanat, so Shanat is your word in singular. Shanat is your word in plural here. So it's years. Ha-Chamishim, the 50th. So you've counted out 49 years. And in this next year, the 50th year, the Ha-Chamishim, the 50th Shana year, Ukeratem, and you will kara, you will call out, you will cry out with a loud, passionate voice. De roar. That's a word for flowing. I'm afraid I missed one here. You'll call out de roar, flowing, swift flight, gyration, hence used of birds, flapping their wings, you know. But it's of, to be free is from the idea of liberty and freedom, from the idea of when you were in prison back in these days, you were thrown in a hole in the ground. Quite literally, it'd be a dried up cistern or dried up well, or maybe just a hole dug for this very specific thing. You have to understand, the further you went down in that hole, the more narrow that hole became. And they would take your hands, lift them above your head, and drop you in there feet first, and then put a big old rock over the top of you. You were in a damp, dark place. And the more you moved around, the further you would go down. And the further you would go down, the more compressed your ribs would become and the harder it would be to breathe. Your jailer, if you will, because this was jail back then, had no responsibility to feed you, to give you water. He had no responsibility to pull that rock off the top and pull you out and take you to some restroom for your necessities and let you get a shower in or let you have your time in the sun. Now he'd just leave you there to rot. It was up to your friends and family to take care of you, and if they didn't, so what? That's how cruel this world was back then. God, of course, didn't allow that, but the world around, at large was doing this sort of thing. And so the idea of liberty was when that stone was pulled away and your sentence was over and your friend or family member reached down there and, I mentioned that about you don't get taken out to go to the restroom. No, you go to the restroom right where you are. And by the time you get out, from the time you go in, if this is an older prison cell, if you will, your feet are going to be in it, who knows how deep, when you get in there. And the longer you're in there, the more your own stuff you'll be in. And your friend or your family member is going to go in there and pull you out of that. Yirmiyahu, they call Jeremiah, he was in it up to his chest. They don't want to be too gross, so they call it muck and mire instead of feces. Get the picture? So that was a cramped, dark, horrific place. And then they would pull you out into the light and the liberty and the freedom. That's where this idea comes from. Then you have ba'aretz, so in the land. Lechol, to all or every. Yosh veha, all that dwell there. Yovel, which is where this transliteration from the Hebrew into English, it goes from the word Yovel to Jubilee. The J was added to the English alphabet roughly 650 years ago. It wasn't in the English alphabet when, say, Tyndale and who's the other? Wycliffe. When those guys were translating the Bible into English in the early days, they didn't have a J to work with. It didn't exist. J doesn't come along till right around the time of the King James Version of the Bible. And even then, it wasn't used as a J. It was just a fancy I, which made the Y sound. And the Y made the long E sound. Like if you look at the word machine, E, that's an I. But that was a Y back in the early days. So around 650 years or so ago, maybe not quite that much, the J came along, and so the J took the place of what was then the Y, and the I became the Y. Anyway, it's all confusing. But so you go from probably Yuvel to Jubel to Jubilee for whatever reason, but that's a transliteration of this word, Yovel. That's your word. So Jubilee, I'm going to stick with. or I'm going to call it Yovel, one of the two. Forgive me if I don't keep that straight. Then it says heave, which is she, or it could be the word it, it. Then it says tiya, so it shall be. Lachem, it shall be to you. Veshavtem, which literally means and return you. It'll be a turnaround. It'll be a return. This celebration is all about being returned. Something being returned to you, you being returned to something. It's all about turning from the path you're on back to something that used to be. Kind of like repentance, you know? Then it says ish, which means man, as in as opposed to a woman, man. El, which means two. It also sounds exactly like, and is spelled exactly like the word for God, but it is not. It's the word to, T-O. Be returned to, the man will be returned to ahuzato, possessions he. So we would say his possessions. He's going to be returned to the things that he owns. Oh, wait a minute. To read it in English, he got himself, he sold his land, he sold his house, he sold his cows, whatever, to this guy. And so now he's had to go off and live somewhere else. But in this 50th year, that stuff is going to be returned that he owns according to God, that he still owns all of that. So is it a sale or is it a lease? It's a lease. This is all about leasing what you own, because the person who leased it from you could not keep it. It went back in the 50th year. Certain things went back every 7 years, which we're going to get to if we haven't already done it. I don't remember. Getting a little confused having to redo some of these. Then it says ve'ish. So the man will be returned to his possessions. And now it says and man el to mish pachto. He'll be returned to his family. So here we're looking more at the idea of the man was forced into servitude because he got himself in debt. So now, not only is his debt just now paid, it's totally paid off, regardless of how much he owes at this point, he no longer owes any money. And he no longer has to live at that guy's house to pay off his debt. At this point, he's going to be returned to his family, his stuff, his house, his land, his cattle, whatever. It's all going to be returned to him. That's what this is all about. It's a big deal. Going to be returned to his family. And then Tashuvah, and shall return they. So, and they shall return, and they shall return. Okay, that was the end of it. So my translation, kind of pushing it today, and you will consecrate the year, the 50th year, and call out deror, liberty. Remember that, getting out of the prison, if you will, the wide open spaces. You're going to declare a liberty. And for those of you who have read the New Testament, that ought to stick out, where Shaul is talking about you don't want to give up your liberty. Yes, what he's talking about. In the land to all inhabitants. So in the 50th year, you will call out liberty in the land to all inhabitants. All of them, whether they're Jew or not, doesn't matter. All of them who live there. It will be a Yovel, a Jubilee, and you will return a man's ahuzah, his property, to him. And a man who was sold or lost his family property or something like that, that man will be returned to his family. What do they mean by that? His inheritance. So if he leased his house and his land and whatever else, that was his family inheritance. And at this 50th year, all of that's going to be given right back to that man, because it was his all along. So it was never sold. The people were never sold. Their houses were never sold. Nothing they had was ever sold. It was leased. That's a word we would use nowadays. The possessions that a child of God sells to another child of God, or that a Jew sells to another Jew who's living according to God's law, is still considered to belong to the original, the one said to have sold it. Why? Because we can only lease a man's possessions in God's world. The day of announcement, the beginning of the Yovel, or the Jubilee, begins on the Day of Atonement in the 50th year. All right, I am out of time. Shalom v'shalom.
The blessing, vaYiqra. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.